Hi guys, welcome to today's lesson. We're looking at the anatomy of a HSC exam question, and we'll be focusing on Module C, Text and Society, and of course our elective is Elective 1, Exploring Interactions, and we're studying M.T. Anderson's feed. Alright, so the very first thing that we need to consider when we're working out what makes up a HSC exam question is, what is a question? And at its simplest form, it's a sentence. And the sentence is made up of three parts. There is a subject, a verb, and an object. A subject is what the sentence is about. The verb is what is being done or what needs to be done. And the object is how the subject is affected. Questions are the same as sentences. There is a subject, a verb, and an object. For example, in this question, how do you get to Sydney? We can see these three items at play. The subject of our question is Sydney. We're talking about the city of Sydney. Our object is get to. We're trying to establish how we get to Sydney. And the verb of the sentence is how. We want to be given directions. Now we're going to take a few minutes to look at common essay verbs and what they mean. Some of this will be rehashing old information, and you'll be able to interpret these notes to help you with the match-up exercise. So some of the most common essay terms that you're going to see at HSC level English are analyse, compare, and sometimes compare and contrast, critically analyse, critically evaluate, describe, discuss, evaluate, explain, explore, justify, and to what extent. An analyse question asks us to break a topic into its parts, and then we have to look in depth at each of those parts and provide supporting arguments and evidence. We also need to look at the relationships between those different parts. A compare and contrast question asks us to identify the similarities and the differences between two or more things, and we need to highlight those similarities and differences that are more important than others. So we need to say which one has the most impact. Then our critically analyse and critically evaluate questions I'm going to tackle together. The critically analyse question is only slightly different to an analyse question. We have to just take one extra step. So we still break an issue into its parts and we look in depth at each of those parts and their relationships. The final step is to make a judgment about what's good and what's bad about each of those parts. A critically evaluate essay takes an analyse question one step further again. So you've made a judgment about what's good and bad about each part. In the critically evaluate, you look at each aspect, you make a list of the positives and negatives, and then you make an overall judgment about the importance or the significance of the topic as a whole. A describe question is quite a simple one. We need to provide the features and characteristics of something. You'll recognise this term from our alarm table, and it's the second step that we have to do. A discuss or explore question I can tackle together. So for each of these, you need to provide all the points of view on a topic. So maybe there's 3 different approaches to a certain problem, and you need to adopt a questioning approach, and you need to explore how do each of those work, what's good and bad about them, and make a judgment about which method or which answer is the most correct, the most relevant, or the most effective. An evaluate question, I want you to think back to our critical evaluation. It's very, very similar. You must make a judgment based on criteria. You need to determine the value of something. So either how important it is, how correct it is, or how right it is. Now sometimes the criteria will be provided by the question. Sometimes you will need to define the criteria for yourself within your essay. An explain essay asks you to write about the cause and effect. You need to show the relationship between different things and state how or why something happens. Again, this is a term that you'll recognise from our alarm matrix. And in explain, we need to say, why does something exist? Why does it matter? Our justify essay questions ask us to support an argument or a conclusion. We need to give reasons to show why something should or shouldn't happen, or why it should or shouldn't exist. And finally, our to what extent questions tells us to assess how true or how correct something is. In order to do that, you need to present evidence, and you should also explore alternative explanations. But like any essay, you need to make an overall decision about what you think should be done. Now we're going to have a look at the 2015 exam question. If you'd like to pause the video now, you can complete your match-up activity from the Anatomy of the HSC worksheet. Alright, welcome back, and we're going to have a look at the 2015 Module C exam question. Now this was the very first question based on these new prescriptions and with the new title for this elective, Exploring Interactions. Okay, so the question was, interactions with others challenge attitudes and beliefs. To what extent do the texts you have studied in this elective support this view? In your response, refer to your prescribed text and one other related text of your own choosing. Now what I'd like you to do on your worksheet is to circle the subject, underline the verb with a straight line, and underline the object with a squiggly underline. Pause this video for a moment just so you can do that. Okay, hopefully you'll have gotten the same as me. So the subject of our essay is attitudes and beliefs. You are writing about attitudes and beliefs. When we interpret this question, your essay should be based around different attitudes and different beliefs held by different characters. The verb should be quite obvious because we've just gone through them, and it's to what extent. So you need to say, how much do interactions challenge these attitudes and beliefs? Leading us straight into the object of the essay, which is interactions with others. So you're looking entirely at how big an impact do interactions with other people and other objects challenge our attitudes and beliefs. Alright, we're going to have a look at linking questions to the rubric. As we know, the rubric is one of the most important documents for all of our topics because it is the driving force behind every exam question. The question cannot come from outside the rubric. So if you understand the rubric, you will know what to expect in an exam. This should just be a little bit of revision. We went through this at the end of last term. We're going to look at some key ideas from the rubric. So this first section is just the general description from the syllabus. So Module C, Texts and Society. This module requires students to explore and analyse texts used in a specific situation. It assists students' understanding of the ways that texts communicate information, ideas, bodies of knowledge, attitudes and belief systems in ways particular to specific areas of society. Electives in this module are designed around a specific social context and the texts that are characteristic of and valued within it. Prescribed texts will be drawn from a variety of professional and social contexts. Students are also required to supplement this study with texts of their own choosing related to the module. So let's have a look and break this down into its important parts. So, the first idea is the purple box. We're looking at texts used in a specific situation. The situation for feed is satire. So looking at the use of humour, irony, exaggeration or ridicule to expose and criticise people's stupidity or vices. We're also looking at ways that texts communicate information, ideas, bodies of knowledge, attitudes and belief systems. Now these become our 5 pillars of communication. So when you are analysing feed and your related material, you should be looking at how does interaction help to communicate information? How does it communicate an idea or ideas? How does it communicate bodies of knowledge? How does it communicate attitudes? And how are belief systems communicated? Finally, we're looking at what context our text is drawn from. And ours is a social context. It's a satirical prose fiction young adult dystopian novel. The purpose of it is to entertain, therefore it is a social text as opposed to a professional text. The second part of this document says students explore the role of textual features in the shaping of meaning in specific contexts. They develop the communication skills necessary for a wide variety of personal, social, historical, cultural and workplace contexts. Composition focuses on analysing and experimenting with textual forms characteristic of the specific context. These compositions may be realised in a variety of forms and media. Alright, so our first idea that we're looking at is textual features. And so you need to specifically look at the textual features or the techniques used in prose fiction. So you need to examine things like narrative structure, characterization, humour, irony, exaggeration, simile, metaphor, descriptive language, and the style of narration, such as first, second, and third person. When you're composing, you need to focus on analysing those 5 pillars of communication that I mentioned before. So how does M.T. Anderson communicate information through satirical prose fiction? How does he communicate ideas through his satirical prose fiction? How does he communicate bodies of knowledge, attitudes and belief systems through satirical prose fiction? Alright, now we're going to look at the specific part of the rubric for our elective, Exploring Interactions. In this elective, students explore and analyse a variety of texts that portray the ways in which individuals live, interact and communicate in a range of social contexts. These contexts may include the home, cultural, friendship and sporting groups, the workplace and the digital world. Through exploring their prescribed texts and texts of their own choosing, students consider how acts of communication can shape, challenge or transform attitudes and beliefs, identities and behaviours. In their responding and composing, students develop their understanding of how the social context of individuals' interactions can affect perceptions of ourselves and others, relationships and societies. Students will choose one of the following texts as the basis for their further exploration of this elective, and we of course are studying M.T. Anderson's prose fiction Feed. Right, so there's some big ideas in this section of the rubric. So first of all, we've got a list of contexts that we need to consider. Particularly important for us studying Feed is the digital world, friendship, home and cultural. We see not so much in terms of sporting and workplace, although there are hints about workplace communication from when we see Titus's father. So what you need to ask is, how are these contexts represented? And we want to think about our 5 pillars of communication. So how are the ideas, attitudes, belief systems, knowledge and information communicated in each of those settings? So how is communication of ideas different at home, to the workplace, to the digital world, for instance? Next, we want to look at how communication can shape, challenge and transform our attitudes, beliefs, identities and behaviours. And so we need to split those into 2 sections there. First of all, we've got shaping. So how is something formed? Challenging. How are we asked whether or not we're right or wrong? And transformation is obviously changing something. Then we've got 3 things that could be shaped, challenged or transformed, and those are attitudes, so what we think is right and wrong, our identities, who we are, and our behaviours, how we act. And each of those can be linked together. So attitudes can be shaped, challenged or transformed. Identities can also be shaped, challenged or transformed, and behaviours can be shaped, challenged and transformed. So if you are asked to write about attitudes and beliefs, for instance, you would need to talk about how the attitudes were first shaped, how they were challenged, and then how they were transformed. Lastly, we want to look at how individuals' interactions can affect perceptions of ourselves and others, relationships and societies. So ultimately, this topic is all about getting you to think critically about yourselves, others and society at large. Alright, now it's your turn. I'd like you to work on your worksheet, and you're going to circle and underline the verbs, subjects and objects in 4 example essay questions. And I'd also like you to just link it to the rubric by putting a couple words. Maybe it's the quote from the rubric that's being used in the question. You might choose to highlight this, however you choose to represent your thinking, to show how you can see the question is an evolution of the rubric. Once you've finished that, turn the worksheet over, and I'd like you to use the rubric printed on there to develop 4 of your own essay questions. So look at the 5 essay questions that we'll have now looked at. Examine how they are drawing on the rubric and the ideas from the rubric, and see if you can come up with 4 of your own. Good luck.